Hello, hello. It is Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. Thanks for joining me. I am not alone today. I am with one Marc Daniel Nelson. I've been waiting to have an excuse to have Marc Daniel Nelson on the SonicScoop channel for ages. Super glad to have him here today. The reason we have him on is there's a free plugin out, temporarily free, that Marc knows a little bit about. Marc, thanks so much for joining me today. How are you doing?
How's it going, Justin? Glad to be here, finally doing something fun.
Yeah, it is going infinitely better now that Marc Daniel Nelson is on the SonicScoop channel. And the excuse that we have today, Marc, is that Marc knows a little bit about a plugin that is temporarily for free. Soundtoys is giving away the Phase Mistress, which normally sells for $100. And right now, I think only until about November 15th, you can get this plugin totally for free. And one of the reasons I want to have Marc on to talk about is because Marc has a great way of dealing with the idea of movement in a mix. I know one of the things that Marc complains about is mixes that are overly static, overly kind of dry and boring. And phasers, we don't all know how to use them, but I think Marc does. So Marc, can you give me a little bit of a sense for, first of all, what the word movement means to you in the context of a mix? And then I want to ask you a little bit about phasers in general, and then we'll jump into this plugin specifically and some other ideas around creating movement. So Marc, what comes to mind when you think of that idea of movement in a mix and how to achieve it?
Well, for me, it's always about the movement. I've said that quite a bit over the years, and I enjoy interesting elements that rooted all the way back from working under Bill Schnee, where he would do all these automation tricks and panning and bringing up instruments when the vocal's not there. There's other tricks to be able to be under the radar that you don't really hear but you feel, and that is not necessarily about reverb or the space of automation or panning or delay or stuff like that. Usually we don't think about phasers as much as, they were popular in the 70s. They were very popular in the 90s. In fact, one of my longest backstories I can remember was my first guitar pedal was a really crappy Boss plastic digital effects processor. And I annoyed the living daylights out of my friends and bandmates with horrible sounding phasing guitars. What I didn't know is using it subtly, it's more about what you're feeling in the movement. Now the Phase Mistress plugin, which I've had for a long time, is one of those kind of sleeper tricks that you can really dig in without really hearing the chorusing and the aggressive filtering of a phaser. Now obviously it does that extremely, but for me, using it on like a track like I'm doing today, which is this very acoustic track by the band, or they're a group. It's a guy and a girl from Norway called We Met in June. The song is called 2 Feet on the Ground. Very acoustic-y, 4 on the floor kick drum, some synth stuff, piano, melodic kind of hits. There's a 10cc song that I loved growing up that had stacks and stacks of vocals on it that always had this kind of phase kind of element. And that could have just been because they were multi-tracking 50 vocals, but it always had this really neat thing on the background vocals that I have something similar going on this track too. So in a nutshell, that's kind of pretty much it when we're talking about trying to add, elements of emotion without really hearing it. Because half the time mixing is all about your first impression and how you respond to a song. And you can do that with automation. You can do that with EQ. Compression is a big deal. But how do you find ways to create space in a mix that just doesn't sound static? And using plugins and software or any sort of hardware that does modulation subtly, that you can literally have control over the mix knob so it's not full on as well, is your best friend. And I'll show basically a handful of parts in this song in a very acoustic environment that were working really well. When I solo it, you can really hear it. But in the mix, you don't really hear it. You feel it more than anything.
Right. Yeah, let's hear a little bit of the mix maybe in its totality, and we'll have people guess about what instruments the phasers are on. You guys also are here with us. If you're here with us for the live premiere, you can ask us questions as we're going on. But as Marc first plays through a little bit of this, try to guess if you can hear where the phaser is coming in and let us know in the chat box. And also, for those of you who don't know Marc, I could have given him an even more warm welcome to the channel because I'm just assuming all of you know who Marc is. But for the few of you who don't, Marc is producer, engineer, mixer. He's been at it for for decades, and he's worked on studio albums, live albums. I believe he even won a Grammy for mixing a live album recently. And what else? A lot of film score mixing. So we've really been all over the industry for a long time. And if you want to check out more from Marc, check out his Make Mine Music series over on the Produce Like a Pro channel, where he is also prolific. So without further ado, Marc, let's get into hearing a little bit of this and get a sense for the track as a whole.
Great. Yeah, so right now, I'll just play it from the verse. I'll give a little presentation, a little more, so we can get into the song, because a lot of it is all about hearing what you're ingesting for the first time. So I'm going to play the verse into the bridge, and then we can kind of dissect what we're doing.
Great. Let's check it out.
I like to picture me as someone else, 'cause she is perfect as far as I can tell. It makes me feel less unwell. But there you are, you save me every day. There you are, my sweet melody. There you are, you fight with a doubt in me. You fight with a doubt in me.
Okay, so cutting you in.
Gorgeous.
What I'm trying to do here is be subtle with things kind of swirling around without it sounding like you're using a pan plugin or width plugin and stuff like that. Just little things. So I'm going to dissect a little bit going into it and showing you a little the phaser mistress on different elements. The first stuff I'm doing is the synthesizer. Now, obviously, we know that in a synthesizer, I'll take it off first and play it for a second. This track is more of a noise track. It's a stereo noise track. If you keep your eye on the modulation, you're kind of seeing what's happening here. This was under a custom setting I used on the Sterilizer 3, and I just kind of, adjusted things to where I thought the taste would be really good at it. If I put it in, it sounds something like this. Now it's going to be subtle, so pay attention a little bit. This track is a little more subtle than the other stuff. Let me go back. Okay, so in, out. This version, this setting, is doing more spatial stuff. It's creating, instead of it being like a stereo image, it's creating it to be kind of like this sort of thing. It's not panning across like this. It's kind of like goosing the left and right channel just a little bit and creating a little more width. If I bring in the soft pad, which is a lot more of a traditional synth, you can hear by itself the phaser. If I take it out, it sounds neat, but in, again, keep an eye on the modulation to see kind of what it's doing. Now, both of these up, you see that they're going in completely different directions.
Yeah.
Now put these together. This is more sound design than anything for a track.
Yeah.
If I take it out, it just becomes kind of flat and static. This adds a little sense of movement without it sounding way over the top like you're playing in the 1970s rock band with your flanger going on or your phaser pedal going on.
100%.
That's
The synth Go ahead.
Well, go ahead.
The synth, it sounds like it just has more development in, if that makes sense. It just sounds like it's evolving over time. And I always get this inclination to, whenever I hear a good amount of phaser, same with hearing a wah-wah, I just want to move my mouth along with it. I just hear that like, wow. And I just want to
someone said something like the phaser is like underwater and the flanger is like having your head put to like a paper towel thing and being spun around a chair.
Oh,
so, yeah,
sure.
That appearance of like, modulation is such a kind of human trait of being in like a car and like the Doppler effect. And it's very human in my opinion. So like creating just little bits of shifting and elements, it just makes it a little more alive without it sounding over the top. Now I do use some over the top stuff in this track and you can hear it. And we can go to that actually now, but I don't know if you were going to ask anything before I move on.
No, I was just giving my little tasting notes here that it was so subtle on the initial one where it just felt like it was almost widening out just a hair to me and almost becoming a little bit more ambient and distant without sounding reverbed. And a similar thing happens to the second sound, but you hear a little bit more of that development over time of it swirling and feeling like it's morphing as the song goes along. So especially subtle when you hear it in the whole mix, but you can really hear that second one in solo pretty well.
What's happening, though, is when you're adding it together, that's when things start becoming a little more obvious because when you're watching the modulations, they're going all over the place. They're not tracking each other, which is pretty crucial when you're setting up like the tempo and stuff because a lot of people just like to use whatever they can and lock it into the tempo of the song. And I've always been a big fan of being a little more radical and tapping things in a little odd just to create a little tension there. And that's what's creating that effect of making things a little different. Making things a little different is a lot easier than making things in uniform all the time.
Right. One of the benefits to not always doing things locked into the tempo is that you can use less effect and hear it more because it can kind of poke out a little bit more. And it also, I think that's part of what's giving that sense of development because we're not always in the same spot in the modulation on the same beat of the song. Where we are in the modulation ends up changing over the course of the song, which gives it that developing feel instead of a repeating feel.
Correct. And here's a perfect example. I pulled up this electric guitar part on the bridge. And you can see here, I have it set as a sine. This one's set as triangle wave. These shapes are very different. So they're all going to be very kind of different sounding. And when I'm playing just the guitar, you're going to watch again all these modulations shifting in different ways. But let me just play the guitar without it first. Has a little bit of a tremolo that's built into the track. This is with the phaser. You can hear that a little more. We're stepping into guitar territory, but that's okay. If I had it on full wet, it would sound like this. A little too much. I like the mix knob with the phaser because when you feel like the setting's good, you can really bring it back. Let me just pull in a banjo and then another guitar with it. I'm going to play this without on the electric guitar so you can hear some movement of the other guitars going. And then I'm going to play it with. And you'll be able to, again, hear how it's kind of changing things up. Now with it in, same part. I'm always about like very little movements. It's really obvious when you make things, 80% better. It's easier to do that to me. It's a lot harder to build mixes with 5% changes. What I'm hearing with this guitar with it on, The guitar is like almost leaning in more. The notes are sustaining differently than they would with it out, because the way that the filter is going on the electric guitar, the sine wave shape, is causing things to kind of stand up a little better than without it. And most people would think, well, just add compression or add reverb. I don't want that. I don't want the sound of over compression to create, things to come up. And half the time, I don't have the time to automate every single track as well to do exactly what I want it to do. And sometimes it's fun to make things a little more random instead of having full control over everything. Let's see. I think I have another guitar with the phaser on it, maybe the banjo. Yeah. These are the licks here. I'm going to take it out fully so we can hear the whole track of this part, and then I'll go back into it, just this hook. So those little hooks, it's between a banjo. Let me see if I can just slowly, there we go. The banjo and the piano. They both have the Phase Mistress on it. I can pull all three of these on. Let me shut these off so we can see what we have for that, what we have for this, and then what we have for the piano. They're all doing, again, different things. The piano, it's doing this very weird, glitchy thing that I found from this preset called Cool Rezo, and then I adjusted it from that. Now the banjo hook is doing a little thing called Bad Radio, which is going to make it a little more broken and whiny, and then another one is just the traditional deep phase that we talked about earlier on this electric guitar. If I solo just the banjo, without, again, really subtle. If I cranked up the wet, you're hearing the mouse.
Yes.
But we're trying to create, just, you hear that just on the little top, it's the air.
Yeah.
Versus, it's really subtle. It just sounds like mice or something kind of crawling around the banjo.
Yeah, and there's the
piano.
stereo.
Oh, go
There's
ahead.
a stereo component to it as well that's just shifting its position in the mix ever so slightly without it being a huge ping pong shifting or something like that.
Right. And then the piano, that's basically doubling what that sound is. This has quite a bit more sound.
Yeah.
Without. This one's neat because it kind of sounds like what they would do back at Abbey Road, back when they were working with the Beatles. If you listen to like the White Album and how they were using ADT and stuff, there was a law between ADT, flange, and phasing. It was all about the modulation of just like how hard they used the VSO and how hard they pushed each element and like created elements of trash in the tape, literally wrapping the tape so it'd go over the machine differently to create all these different effects. If you listen to like Don't Pass Me By, the piano is all like crazy sounding, and that's what this reminds me of. Without, it's fine and pretty,
Yeah.
but this is where it can be really cool. When you see, I always like to back it down and then together. It just has this sound where it's a lot. Let me pull the whole mix in
I was about to say, yeah.
without.
Sure.
And then with, again, very subtle. This is with.
Yeah.
It's very subtle, but it's very obvious what it's doing. I keep hearing the mice crawling in the banjo and the mice crawling in the piano, where it's creating just a little off-put and just a different character and tone.
Yeah, there's this character that's adding almost to the reverb. Like when I'm listening to it in solo, I hear it as an effect on the instrument. But when you play it in the context of the whole mix, where it really leaps out at me is in changing the character of the reverb on the banjo and the piano. And I'm not thinking of it as being a phaser. It hits my ear and I'm like, oh, that's an interesting reverb patch he's using on the banjo and the piano. I wonder what's doing that. And the thing is, that's a phaser that's going into the reverb. So but that's not immediately what you think on hearing it in the full context.
Well, normally the phasing sound you would think in your head would be that really aggressive comb filtering thing, which let's pull up the background vocals. And I'm going to go to my bus and see what we've got here. I have this on my background bus.
You're just Phase Mistress mad today. This is like our eighth
this
iteration
song,
of Phase
I told
Mistress.
you,
This is
like,
awesome.
It was weird when you reached out to me and I was like, you know what? I just did a song that I used the crap out of that thing.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of it is we're all using virtually a lot of the same plugins. And how to stand apart from people, you got to be creative and pull in different sounds and stuff. And just the Phase Mistress as a modulating plugin didn't really get the love as much as it used to because there's new things going on. So going back and revisiting, I think it was an accident that this song, I fell upon it because it started with the background vocals. And when I was going through the presets and stuff, I started going, that would be cool on the pianos and these little hook things that are just making it sound a little more interesting than just a traditional piano. For this song, on the background vocals, if I scroll up to the section, I can bypass it first and we can just listen to the background vocals. I'm going to put it in right here on the turnaround. Very obvious.
Yeah.
Soloed, you'd go,
yes,
it's a little too much.
This is why you should never
but again,
solo.
Don't solo. If I play it with it again, and this is even down to like 35% on. That's the funny part is if I cook it. I'm going to take it out. I'm going to listen to it with the full without it. So I'm going to mute the lead vocal. And we're going to listen to this bridge with the background vocals, with the full instruments, but without the Phase Mistress on it first, and then we can listen to it with it. Remember, when soloed, you really heard it. And you might still hear it a little bit, which is okay, but it's not nearly as aggressive as you would hear it without.
Yeah.
So without... background vocals are actually kind of quiet.
Yeah.
When I put it in, listen to the air of the background vocals, just the airiness of it. This is with it in. It's a lot more tasteful, but you're getting a lot more airiness out of that.
Absolutely. The only part I was really conscious of it was maybe on the first note of the background vocals before the whole
breaths.
thing. Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
And then after that, it almost, I have to use that word development again, where it just feels like the section is evolving over time. And it almost feels like there's another instrument in there. Like it feels like there's this very quiet pad almost that you've added to it that's playing an additional part, but it's just adding movement to the background vocals. So again, it's one of those things where you hear it in solo, on a dry background vocal and you go, oh, that's a phaser and it's probably too much. You put it in context and all of a sudden it fools you.
Well, mainly it's picking up on anything that's high frequency. And then
Yeah.
you can hear it more on the high frequency stuff because that's where the comb filtering is starting to happen. So it's going bright, dark, bright, the way it's modulating. In a background vocal, that's like 5K up, the breathy stuff, or the anything that has that ah-ness, which is why it worked so well on like the sound design synth stuff. That was almost like noise.
Yeah.
And if you put that on like the sound design pad that we had earlier, this setting, it would just be too much. You would hear it because of that airiness always happening. Being on background vocals, when it's doing ooze, it's not triggering it nearly as much as it does on the breaths and stuff. When you put it on with the background vocals and the lead vocals going as a mix itself, it blends itself even more.
Let's hear that.
You fight with the doubt in me. I'm sitting in the bed with stiff fingers, blood on my guitar, and thinking that I'll never be like them folks on my wall.
Just heard it there.
Very subtle, but again, if you can get that 5% extra on little things here and there, subconsciously, it just makes things sound a little more interesting and a little more fun.
100%. Yeah. And now that I'm really cued in for listening to it, every once in a while, it'll leap out at me for just a moment where I'm like, oh, I heard the phaser. I heard it just cresting there. And sometimes I'm just so unconscious of it. And it is, like you said, more about mood and space and movement rather than consciously hearing it. Now, with that said, Mark, a couple of times when you set this thing to stun, it sounded like instant breakdown to an EDM track. And I think that's your other application here is you could totally use this kind of thing where people in EDM, electronic, or hip hop might use filter sweeps and automated filter sweeps. Using this as an alternate take on the classic electronic production style of filter sweeps, I think is another great place to use this in excess potentially.
Well, that's just because the way that this was modeled, whatever they did in the beginning when they were modeling for this plugin, it sounds different than their other modular filter, like the comb filtering modulation filter plugin that they, I can't remember what it's called, Filter Bank or something. It just sounds different. And obviously when you're getting kind of radical with things, it's really easy to get those sounds. And most of the time you would create automation cue points on the plugin up here. And, you know, it for the going into the mix or whatever, you would automate the resonance of it going into a drop or something. And that way you have the control of it doing exactly what you need it to do. I know in the early 2000s, late 90s, it was really trendy to do filter and phase drops into choruses and stuff like that. And you can do that here very easily. And under the radar, it's a lot easier to do that. You would probably want to print that though, because even though this is all recallable, everything is changing. So if you really get it perfect, you want to print that right away. Just print that sound to it.
Well, this is a great point. One of the things I was thinking of is when you're not locked to a grid rhythmically and you're using it in kind of free floating mode, depending on where your playhead starts, you might end up with the crest of the phaser being in a different place. So if you're really trying to get one section like precise, you might want to keep that playhead in the same spot every time and print your phaser. Because if you start your playhead, another second back, the crest of your phaser might happen down a different part of the bar. So that's one of the only issues potentially with working with it outside of the rhythmic lock mode, if that makes any sense.
But that goes with delays. That goes with very long reverbs, goes with flanging, any kind of echo. You really have to make sure, because if you're working with a client, let's say you're not working on your own stuff and you're mixing a song for a band or whatever, even if you're in the band and you're mixing it and the bandmates hear it, whatever it is, they're going to hear the first version and it's going to be printed off that. So if there's a delay throw or phaser that's going on that's triggered off the head, like you're saying, and then you do a third version and it's not going to comb the same way, you really want to kind of pay attention to that. It's very subtle things, but like I can't tell you the times where I didn't spend time to capture those like interesting sounds. I think Tom Lord Alge has this video where he demonstrates on one of the songs he did in the early 2000s about flanging drums, and he ended up doing it in the digital domain, but he still ended up printing it because he was 100% right about, like, you can't recapture that if you already kind of had it going. You got to capture it right away so you have it in the future, or it's just going to sound different. Like anything, even plugins, things change. If it's modulating just a little bit, it will change in a very subtle way.
Yeah. So we have some questions coming from the audience, if you don't mind me asking some, Mark. I'll start with some of the questions that are more pertinent to today's topic, and then I'll go into some of the other ones that are coming in. But one of them from Christian, he asks, how does this phaser compare to the pedal phaser that Mark always uses? I remember him using a pedal phaser on a bass and calling it swampy. So I would just interject real quick to say that there's multiple phasers emulated in here, probably including whatever phaser you're using on that. So do you remember that what phaser pedal you might have used on a bass that he might be referring to as being swampy?
I do. That specific one came in. That was a project I was mixing for a band, and that came in with that on it. I think it was an Avid phaser plugin, basically modeling whatever the original phaser pedal, the MXR or whatever that was. Very subtle, very specific sound. Not a lot of options. The reason why the Phase Mistress is a lot more interesting, it's kind of like the Echo Boy versus just like a traditional tape echo plugin. Yeah. The tape echo plugin sounds great, but the features that are in Echo Boy are just vast. So you're able to get way more options out of it. That goes the same with this Phase thing. I think for that, if you want to get a default sounding phaser, just this in default sets you right there. It's very, very, very simple sounding. But then when you want to make it a little more interesting, you can go into the sets and kind of start playing around with it. I like the modulation light where this is kind of toggling. So I kind of know what's happening. And when we're not hearing it nearly as strong when it's on a little more dry of the mix, you can kind of see that. That's not an option with the plug-in like guitar pedal ones.
Yes. The one thing I'll add here is looks like a very simple and easy plugin to use, just like Echo Boy, and it is, but there's a whole bunch more to it. Like if you click that tweak button on the bottom right there under the input-output control, that gives you a drop down where you get to see the shape of it. So Mark was talking earlier about, a sine shape versus a triangle shape, and you can see the shape of the phaser's movement. You can also, I think with the shape editor, I believe you can like write in your own custom shape.
Right.
So you can
and
start.
You absolutely can automate anything. So once you
Yes.
set it up.
And then I think under style, that's where you'd select different pedals. Cadmium is writing in here saying that he thinks the phaser this person is talking about that you used was the Electro Harmonix Electric Mistress guitar pedal.
Oh, the blue one. Yeah.
80s.
Yeah. The silver blue one. Right. Which is its own beast because that does sound like the 70s in a nutshell perfectly.
Totally. And I think if you click where it says style in the upper left, right under the mix knob, then I think that is where you're going to find a lot of the different things that are emulated. Maybe if you click right on the words of it. That's cycling through them. And if you click right on the style name, that might pull up a list. It's either that or you click style edit. Yes, that's it. Style edit. Yeah. And there you see the names of all of them. If you can read off a few of those to us.
So Phase 90, I believe that's the orange.
That's
pedal.
The MXR orange one, yeah. Yep.
Now the other blue and silver one that was just mentioned, I can't remember what that was based around, but I know exactly what that would be. I mean, there's all sorts of ones. There's like Classic 7, 12, the Primes, which is prime number based. I don't know what handful of these are based around, but it's interesting because I didn't even realize there was this many options because I'm going off of going through presets and then adjusting the presets.
Yeah.
This just really opens it up even further.
Yeah, one of the things people don't recognize sometimes about Soundtoys plugins is you can get so much out of them just by using the extremely simple interface that they start off with, which is like 4 main knobs and then a rate knob. And it's obvious that you can go and change the shape with those up and down cursors, and you can grab presets. But if you hit that style edit, whenever you see a button like this, you hit the style edit, you hit LFO, you hit tweak, it's like a whole nother world of controls that the super nerds can get into, and the more intuitive mixers can just completely ignore, So you have that choice.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah. Another question here. Music Mania asks, what is Mark's favorite plugin from Soundtoys? That's hard, so I'm going to say top 3. What do you think, aside from Phase Mistress, which is free right now till November 15th? Go to soundtoys.com, just get it for free. You'll have it forever. It's not like a trial. Just get it for free while they're giving it away. Aside from Phase Mistress, what do you think your 3 most used Soundtoys plugins are and why?
Obviously, the Decapitator is, historically probably one of the best plugins ever designed. I think people are kind of burned out of that, but they're not using the other options, the other line amp options, which is because it defaults and then people just put that on and it has a sound. People are like, oh yeah, I've heard that. I want other options, saturation. Well, you go through the other line amp options of the way it's modeled. That's completely different sounding stuff. Echo Boy is always good. The Radiator, the Radiant one. I mean, honestly, Alt Boy, the Alter Boy.
Little Alter Boy, yep.
They're all, Soundtoys was historically such a massive part because they would release like a handful of things versus it being one at a time. And they've been around for how many years? 20 years, something like that? 18
At
years?
least slightly longer now, yeah. But more than 20 years.
But yeah, they're still so good. And obviously some of the EQs that they built that a lot of people like, I've always been really fascinated as someone that built a plugin myself, like how you can create digital code to sound completely unique to one another. And, I had this conversation with Stephen Slate 2-3 weeks ago about, how their Slate sounding plugins sound very different than Soundtoys, and Soundtoys has its own thing, and Waves and UAD. It's interesting how they all have its own sound. Soundtoys specifically, it's a very recognizable sound, I would say, but it's very unique in the sense that I don't know what other companies can make that sounds like that, because they're not necessarily putting out stuff that's like cloning 1176. Here it is. This is 1176. They've been able to do, and they were probably one of the first that were able to do something where it's like familiar looking. You're like the Radiator plugin. You're like, that kind of looks like an Alt-Tech. I think that's what it's trying to do. But the cool part about it is they've also introduced the junior aspects of these things, which is a lot more affordable for people. I don't know. It's funny because if I click into my plugin window, like everyone's, we have a zillion plugins. And the problem is, like, at what point do you stop and say that's too much?
Right.
You're always going back to the classics. For me, it's going back to stuff that I know. Oh yeah, I forgot. I used that 16 years ago. That worked out really well, which is kind of how this Phase Mistress came back into play on this track. Pretty cool.
Yeah. I've got to say that there came a point in my life where the plugin list was just so crazy, and I remember being ecstatic when they released, or eventually I realized that they had released a search function for plugins in Pro Tools. That was monumental for me, and I think I almost never scroll through my plugins anymore. It's like searching my brain, what do I have, and I just type it in. It's rare these days that I think I scroll through.
It's a funny thing where all these features come in and then you can remember what you use. The Decapitator, going back to the Decapitator, it was just so easy to get saturation to sound musical out of it. So that would always go into one of my guaranteed banks. You get your 2 banks of plugins that you're always going to use in Pro Tools. And for the longest time, Decapitator was in one of those 2 banks because it was just even subtle with the mix knob. That was the other thing. Like, Soundtoys was one of the first guys to always implement mix knob, always. And that very early on. So you weren't having to like double clone stuff and use parallel to get things to sound more balanced as a parallel compressor or a parallel desaturator, parallel phaser. So yeah, they were very ahead of the time for sure.
Yeah. Now, another question here from Music Mania, piggybacking on that, because he heard you talking about the Decapitator. He's curious what style you like on the Decapitator for drums, vocals, and acoustic guitar. Do you know which styles you mostly use in it?
Yeah, let's bring that up for a second while I do it and just type it in and look at that.
Yeah.
So P and T I like a lot. Now, I've talked to friends about what they think these two are. P, someone mentioned either P or T is based around a thermonic culture kind of
Yes,
sound.
I believe that T is the culture vulture and P is a modded one. And they do say in the manual, so if you ever wanted to get super nerdy, say we were looking at all of the different
Styles,
modes, the styles that were in Phase Mistress, or the different styles that are here in Decapitator, if you go into the Soundtoys manual, it will tell you. And I believe that's exactly correct, is that T is the culture vulture and then P is a modded one. But don't trust me, double check the manual. It's definitely in there.
One of the most special sides of the Decapitator over a lot of other saturator boxes is when you're going into it, it's so easily laid out. So if I'm driving into this, I'll go back to a thing that Pensado once said about trying to add body to a snare drum. He needed to get more pump and body of a snare drum without it sounding too obvious. So what he did was he added fur with the drive, then toned it down really dark. Mm-hmm. So on its own, it's just like, yeah. But when he took it all the way off in the drive or on the mix knob, you're like, okay. And then he slowly brought it in. All it was doing was bringing in the dark, fat fur, which was so like, oh my God, that was exactly how you do it. It's not EQ. You're not looking at the fundamental of that low 140 on a snare. That's an easy way to get it, but then it just sounds like a resonant EQ hitting a snare stick hitting an EQ, as Bill Schnee used to call it, when it sounded like over-the-top EQing. This, it's like all you're doing is adding the thick fur with it dark and then mixing it in. So magical. Super cool.
Love it. Vertical Pulse has a question. I don't know if this one is too specific for you, but he says, how are you all using Primal Tap from Soundtoys? I always end up using Echo Boy. And that is a tricky one because Echo Boy is like one of the most robust full-featured delays ever made in history. And then they came out with another delay plugin called Primal Tap. And that one, I think they came out with it because there was a very specific kind of delay that they were trying to emulate that could only be done on this original piece of gear that they were modeling. And I don't know enough about it. This would be a great question for Mitch, but do you know?
I would say this is, just looking at it's clearly based around a lexicon unit. I'm assuming, and maybe the comments, which I don't see, could say but it's looking like that echo unit that the lexicon made. They made a reverb that kind of looked like this, and then they made a delay unit. And it looks like, just with the multiplier and the feedback options, that's what it is. It's a completely different sound than Echo Boy. I think Echo Boy can be any sort of delay, digital or analog.
Yep.
This, I'm assuming, is way more designed around the early 80s into the mid 80s delays that Lexicon was building.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very different sound.
Yeah, it's a strict emulation of the prime time digital delay that Lexicon was making. But, Echo Boy can do digital delay sounds already, but I think there was a pretty specific sound that they felt like they couldn't emulate from the prime time.
Well, the freeze was a huge sound.
Maybe that's what it was, the freeze, yeah. Yep, the freeze function. Cool. Yeah, nice. All right, let me get into some more questions here for you. This is a funny one. Bradley Ward asks, if I wanted to start selling Soundtoys as a social influencer, how does the commission structure work? Thanks. Bradley, there is actually no commission for Soundtoys. It's not like some of the other plugin companies out there where people are like getting a dime or a dollar or whatever it is every time you buy a Soundtoys plugin. Literally the way it works with Soundtoys is they were one of the first advertisers ever for SonicScoop. SonicScoop started in, I think it was 2008 or 2009. And they were literally one of the first three advertisers were Joe Lambert Mastering, still advertised this day with SonicScoop on the website. Alto Music still advertises this day with SonicScoop, and Soundtoys. They were one of the first three. They've been doing it ever since. And I think part of it was we were just like friends with those guys because we thought they made like really awesome plugins and they liked the content we were putting out. And it's just, we've had a good relationship with them ever since, and they've been supporters of the channel ever since. But no, I don't get any commission if you buy Soundtoys stuff. I just genuinely like their stuff and want people to know about it, and that's why they're a constant supporter of the channel. So it's
I can add one thing
at that point. Yeah, please.
I can add one thing. I'm not getting paid to do it either. And how do you get commission on free? I mean, it's just
Right. Yeah. Yes.
I think the biggest thing is, I mean, I get it, the sarcasm, but this is all about just reintroducing things. And this is an older company that still makes amazing stuff.
Yeah.
And, you know, if we want to put all the focus onto the phaser again, that's great. But the biggest nutshell is they're offering free, and free is always king.
Yeah.
And no amount of money I'm not making $1 off of commission or anything like that. I wouldn't be here for that. Like, the whole point of this was Justin came in going, you know, he called me, which I'm going to say on this story, which is really odd because I've talked to Justin on the phone 3 times over the last 4 years. We talked many times on emails and stuff, but 3 times on the phone. Each time he's called me, I've been driving from Arizona back to LA. Over the course of 4 years.
That's wild.
He called me going, you're the movement guy. I mean, this would be really cool to do this kind of video where you're breaking down a song. Have you used this plugin in a while? I'm like, yeah, I just used it this summer on this track. So, like, of course I want to present it, and present it on a song that doesn't sound, like you say, EDM or heavy rock, where you can use something that you really wouldn't be pulling out first. Like, that's a big truth right there. Like, this would never be your first choice if you would think about it as a mixer for folk music or as a composer. So, like, being able to add those little things, personalities into a track that's unique. Sometimes the artists hate it, but sometimes they really enjoy it. And, like, I do believe the Mistress is pretty unique in that realm.
You just have to make sure that you don't play it for the artist in solo.
Right, because if you tell them we got phasers on your background vocals, they're going to be like, get out, because this is kind of organic.
Yes.
Just very organic.
Just put it on, ask them how they like the mix. Buffalo Beetle says, darn, I was hoping Soundtoys was going to give away Pan Man, but I actually think that you probably could with Phase Mistress. I wonder if you set the depth low enough, but you keep it in stereo mode, that maybe you could get a Pan Man-like effect out of Phase Mistress. I'm curious. All right.
Maybe in 6 months, Pan Man might be an offer. You just got to keep your eyes open.
I feel like every year they give away a plugin for free, so definitely, stay tuned to what these guys are doing. All right, next question here. There were some specific ones for you. Is this live or pre-record? It is totally live. Yeah, there you go. William Roberts says,
do I need to hold up a piece of newspaper with my face on it?
William Roberts said, I thought they started streaming on the Produced Like a Pro channel by accident. Christoph says that Mark is known for being a legend. I would agree. And Making Music Online says the MXR Phase 90, which is modeled in here, is one of the best guitar pedals of all time. All right, so here's some of the questions. David Gilden. Mark, were you mentored by the late, great Al Schmidt, asks David Gilden.
No. No. My friend Eric Boulanger was. I worked under Bill Schnee, who was really close with Al, and I work with Ken Kelly a lot, and I worked and mentored under Ed Cherney for a little bit, but Al, obviously, I've met him a handful of times over the years and close with his guy that works close to them and stuff. But Al was one of those guys that was very approachable when needed, but I just never connected with them. In fact, when I moved out to LA the first time, right before I moved out to work for Bill, I was with Doug Sachs at the mastering lab very early on, and Al called in and Doug put him on speaker. And it was like one of those moments. I was 25 and I was just like, and Doug's like, say hi, Bart. I'm just like, over the years, you meet these people in person and you see what they're doing. And he was just spectacular at what he did. I was just watching Breakfast at Tiffany's a couple days ago and listening to the Henry Mancini stuff. It's just insane, the legend that man was.
Yeah, indeed. Dave Dial also wants to mention that Mark is also a great guitar player and singer, no doubt. Is this true? Can you tell the people that you do play guitar and sing?
Yeah, that's how I got into it when I was 15. You wanted to be a Beatle, and I don't do it very often anymore. I did a video for fun of covering a Beatles song because somebody kept pushing me to cover that song because it was one of my favorites. I should do it more. I have a lot of guitars still.
Yeah.
But it's kind of like, and I've been saying this for 20 years. When people are like, you need to write more, play more music than you used to. And I always say, it's kind of like owning a pizza restaurant. When you go home, you really don't want to make pizza. So for me, working all day in music, when I get off, the last thing I want to do is just pick up a guitar and start writing music.
I know what you mean.
So I have to be a little more
Yeah,
obvious.
a lot of the times when I'm out of the studio, I end up listening to either like talk stuff, like lectures, or I end up listening to like classical music, something very different from what I work on. That changes though with my daughter. My daughter, who's 7 now, everything seems new when I play it to her because she's hearing all these classic things that, I've heard 1,000 times for the first time. Like the other day, if she hears Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker Suite for the first time, that's a revelation. But also I play like, James Brown for the first time. It's like, what's that? So it's
I stopped
amazing.
listening to like enjoying music as much as I used to, just because we get into it. When I'm in my car, I'm listening to podcasts most of the time or stuff like that. And I think we talked about this the other day because you were saying that you were interviewing Alan Parsons. So we started talking about Dark Side of the Moon. And I said, I just listened to that recently with like really good headphones. And it was at night and I was doing nothing but listening to it like you would, like a proper album like that. And holy cow, how much I enjoyed it again and how special. So I like to go back and crack open those old albums like Jeff Buckley, Grace, or David Gray, his White Ladder album. Like all these albums or some old Radiohead stuff, and literally listen like you're supposed to, start to finish, and just go into the moment. It's really hard to do that in the car. I have Beatles on at all times everywhere because it's kind of like NPR for people where it's just in the background. But in general, it's hard to listen to newer albums all the way through because there's just a lot of stinkers in there that aren't nearly as great. So it kind of throws you off where you're like, this is great. Oh golly, I gotta skip that.
Yes, it is tricky.
Better albums.
Yes, it is tricky when you're listening to new music. You're not necessarily listening to albums that have stood the test of time, which is one of the difficulties. But I think also another thing is people who are drawn to working in music day after day, like you or I, often it's because, for me, like I either engage with music deeply or almost like not at all. And I'd rather, because I know that if I'm going to listen, I'm going to listen in the way that you're talking about, this kind of deep listening, which isn't something that I want to do when I'm shopping for groceries, And,
exactly. And you're not really listening to it in an environment sonically where you're hearing everything great, which is sad because in the 70s and 80s, people used to have listening parties and sit back and have home entertainment systems that could really produce amazing sounds versus a sound bar. Cars is okay. If I'm on a road trip, I do listen to like full albums and stuff. But going and listening, putting on a good pair of headphones, and they don't have to be like $2,000 headphones. They just have to be good headphones. And listening to an album again, it's just super fun.
For sure, man. I mean, $100 pair of headphones today is probably on par with the best headphones from the 1970s had to offer.
Easy.
So we're spoiled today. All right, a couple more questions here. Christoph says that Phaser, the first example, is almost like a univibe or rotary. Oh, I think he's talking about the second example, where, it does have that kind of rotary speaker feel a little bit. Let's go through some more here. One person was asking you here whether you prefer choruses or phasers on synths and why. So maybe that's something we can talk about a little bit. Just the distinction between, you talked about a tiny bit already, but the distinction between phaser, chorus, flanger. How do you hear each of those three as being different, and where would you be inclined to use one rather than the other?
They're all time-based things. Very, very, very small time-based things. It's kind of like the ADT of the Beatles, where they're like taking two images and then putting them in front of each other and moving things. All three of those sort of do that. Chorus, I've never been a big fan of. Maybe a little bit on vocals to get that kind of Chris and Tom Lord Alge rock vocal sound with the one up, one down, that whatever that alt pitch thing that does.
Sure.
Which I forget what is the plugin that Soundtoys has that has the Microshift. That's like, that's a little chorusy to me. That's kind of like that sound. Flanging is really fun, but that's kind of gimmicky to me. Flanging is a little more gimmicky to me, like you would use it on a moment and then that would be it. Phasing is probably my favorite because it's kind of like a hug. It kind of goes and it's thick and it just has a fatter sound. Like flanging seems a little more brittle sounding. Chorus, I just never got on really well. Chorus, it doesn't modulate the same to me. And maybe I don't know how to use it. I've never spent enough time to try to figure it out. But for me, like phasing has always been either aggressively or like non-aggressively my favorite for sure.
Right. Another question from LA Winter about a potentially related effect, because it could be time-based, is Filter Freak. So that is Soundtoys filter plugin. Would you ever use Filter Freak or any of the kind of filter sweeping effects or resonant peaking types of effects that might be in it?
I have used Filter Freak, and usually it comes in from somebody else already liking it and putting it in there. The thing about the filter stuff, the resonant filter guys, is they get a little dangerous for me. Like I don't know or trust myself enough to really understand it. I was never super hyper into synthesizers or filter banks and stuff like that. That really is kind of what this is kind of doing.
Yeah, I would say
It's
the most
cool, but,
popular
like,
usage.
Yeah, I'm just a guy that I've never been really good at learning things through manuals and understanding and focusing on it. I'm kind of twisting knobs kind of guy, and I always feel like I break stuff quicker with the Filter Freak. But if I get it on something like that's already on the track, handed me over for mixing, it always seems to work, and I don't know how they do it. And I'm like, okay, well, I guess I just don't know how to work it, because I'm looking at it here, and I'm looking at the envelope and the attack and stuff, and going back to Dark Side of the Moon and that synthesizer that's going at the beginning of the album, where it's just like changing constantly, and all of
that would be
based
filter
around
movement,
filters and stuff. Yeah, and the attack and the way that things are transiently popping is based around the envelope. I get that, but I can never physically do it, so I don't know how they do it.
Yeah, I would say much more so people who grew up with synthesizers, they have filters built into them as one of the main onboard things that you can tweak. And it's much more dangerous on natural sounding instruments where you can get this notey aspect kind of poking out excessively. So I definitely know what you're saying. Now, that said, the one application for something like Filter Freak, I think, on live played instruments is to treat it like a wah-wah. And there are some auto wah functions in Filter Freak that you could use. Now, that said, I think most guitar players who want to use a wah-wah want to control it as part of their performance. And I think it's an uncommon effect to be added on afterwards. But if you were trying to do a wah-wah style effect on a acoustic instrument or an electric guitar, you could use Filter Freak for that. And the big thing I think to use it for is synths and maybe like weird effects during like a breakdown section. I also think it could be one of your better radio style effects where you could cut off lows and cut off highs, but get like some gain at the same time, some gain in color. So I think those would be the three big applications: is synths, I mean, all day, every day, wah-wah effects, and using it for an alternative way to get more creative, more interesting radio style band limiting effects, if that makes sense.
Great. Yeah. Tons of options.
All right. Vertigo Paul says, putting the effects rack, the Soundtoys effects rack on a vocal send, browsing some presets and mixing it in that way is always a great inspiration. Lots of happy accidents. What are your feelings around presets? Are you a start from presets guy, a do it from scratch guy, or a both guy?
I'm a both guy. I think if you were watching earlier, most of the stuff I was building started with presets, because there's so many things like we talked about under the hood that I didn't realize was going on, that once I go through the presets and I hear a sound, I'm going, that's kind of cool. How do I adjust that? I mean, you find so many things out of presets. It's a lot easier if I knew how to work something. Like for compression or EQs, I don't really use presets. But for stuff that's like a Filter Freak or like the Phase Mistress, there's so much going on under the hood. The modeling of the specifics is either classic versus modern. All these things, it's just by going through presets quickly, you really hear what you're trying to go after and go, okay, I can work with that. I can fix it this way.
Sweet. Dan asks, there's just a couple more questions. You've been so generous with your time. If you have a couple more minutes, there's a couple more questions. Can you take them?
Sure.
All right. Dan asks if you ever use the Microshift from Soundtoys.
Yeah, we just talked about that, I think. That was kind of what we were talking about with chorus, right? It is a very similar micro pitch.
Yeah,
that's based around like the what was it based around? The harmonizer from the 80s and 90s, the one up, one down kind of approach.
I'm pretty sure I'm going to bring it up on the screen for people who are watching the my screen, but that one, the Microshift, I believe it was the harmonizer built in.
Microshift and micro pitch. Let me see what the shift. Yeah, so the shift is.
That one I think is based after the whatchamacallit, the Eventide.
Right. And
the Microshift, yeah, I think that's what he means when he says micro pitch. I think he means Microshift.
There's two different versions. Oh, okay. Yeah. Eventide has micro pitch.
Yes, and probably the Microshift.
And then Soundtoys has Microshift.
Do you know the story, the secret story between Soundtoys and Electro-Harmonix? Do you know the secret story?
No.
All right, I will tell you the secret story. The guy who made the micro pitch effect in the original harmonizer and who made almost all of the presets and all of the sounds, just about all of them, in the original classic Electro-Harmonix boxes was named Ken Bogdanowicz, and he is the founder of Soundtoys. So the founder of Soundtoys was the guy who basically designed pretty much all of the sounds in the original Electro-Harmonix, harmonizers and their big box.
I love the Microshift on vocals. Yeah. That seems to work really good. I think that's similar. That's what reminds me of chorus, maybe. Mm-hmm, like if you listen to an album like Collective Soul Dosage.
Yeah.
That is a late 90s, I think CLA or his brother Tom mixed it. Mm-hmm. If you listen to those vocals, there's just Microshift or the real version of that all over those vocals. And that to me, same as like, just that era of rock stuff. Wallflowers had, Jacob Dylan always has that kind of sound on his voice. And it works really well on vocals. But I don't know if I've ever really used it on anything other than vocals.
Yeah. I would say that another common example for that would be, I think the other thing would be like lead guitars, is that sometimes that was a classic like late 80s, early 90s lead guitar sound. They would be widened out with the, pitch shifting down on one side relative to the other. And I think what distinguishes the Microshift from a conventional chorus to me is that I think of chorus as being a delay where the delay time and therefore the pitch changes over time. And it's a function of the way old school delays work, that as you change the delay time, it would change the pitch. So a chorus is pretty much a delay where that delay time and or pitch is being modulated, whereas the Microshift is slightly more fixed, where one side is delayed relative to the other, and then there's a static amount of delay and a static amount of pitch shift being applied at once, where a traditional chorus would add to that by modulating the length of the delay and or the pitch of the delay, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So they're related concepts, but not identical, in that Microshift it would be a little bit more of a static effect, where chorus would be more evolving like a phaser. But that's me being a super nerd to give you that.
That's good, because I didn't know that.
If you ever want the super nerdy, pedantic, technical answer, it's back in my brain somewhere for most of this stuff.
Perfect. That's why we're here. Try to figure it all out.
All right. I think, we've been going over an hour here. New questions are coming in, but I think we have taken enough time out of Mark's day already. I'm really excited.
Three more questions.
You can do it? Okay.
Yeah, I'm fine with that.
All right.
I got to go eat lunch.
All right. Christoph mentions, I think Zach Wild, he's saying, is using something like that. Oh, Dan is mentioning that the Eventide plug box I was talking about was the H3000. I wanted to say the H9000 because that's their new one.
Right.
Their original was the H3000, and that's the one that Ken Bogdanowicz of Soundtoys basically designed all the sounds in. And interestingly, one of the guys who actually was the quality tester for the H3000 units, who worked there with Ken, is Dave Durr, who started Empirical Labs that makes the Distressor. So those guys were working together there back in the day. All right. William says, any thoughts about creating dimension and building a 3D aspect to the mix would be really helpful. Thank you. So do you have thoughts about not just the movement over time, but the front to back depth at any given moment in a track? What are you thinking of manipulating to achieve that?
With Soundtoys stuff?
It could be in general. You could say anything. The Soundtoys
a lot of it is
made this possible, but you can say anything you want.
Depth is, in my opinion, really difficult. And that's way more sexy to me than anything. It's easier to get width and movement, but depth, without just slapping on reverbs and stuff, is really tricky. And a lot of times, gear is needing to be implemented into that, like hardware stuff. Because summing sometimes creates depth. Sometimes, extreme tube gear. There's just something with some hardware that just makes it a lot easier. I'm not going to plug my own plug-in because that's
Please
known for making things.
I say, yes, mention it. Soundtoys is the sponsor of this thing, but we can talk about any other tools we want. So I think at the end, I want to give people where they can find you, where they can find your plugins, where they can find your courses. But shout out your plugin. Do it.
Well, all I can say is when I built the P455, which is a plugin based around my analog chain, it was mainly to be able to get analog mixes to sound more like, or digital mixes to sound more like analog with depth and the separation of instruments. So that was the Pulsar Modular P455 was designed specifically for that. There's a lot of other things that can do that. The Microshift, believe it or not, is something that you can use to slowly do it because it's almost like an extremely short reverb as well. What you're trying to do is with EQ or any element by stacking things over on top of each other is not all about left and right. It's all about creating a virtual 3D space, like whoever said that, 3D space. And so by putting, and that's a lot more interesting to me than, Atmos, which is obviously really easy to make things sound like they're swarming around your head and stuff.
That's just
stereo
cheating.
So much, stereo is much more challenging.
Oh, yeah. That's why I think that Atmos should always be the secondary mix. Like, you should always make it sound great in stereo first and then make it sound great in Atmos, because it's so much easier to make things sound great in Atmos. You don't have to work half as hard EQing things so that they fit together. You can just pan it somewhere and all of a sudden you can hear everything. You get detail out of everything. So you don't have to work as hard, which is why I think you've always got to do the stereo mix first and then blow it out to Atmos rather than the other way around.
Yeah,
I would also just comment conceptually for people. I'm going to get pedantic and technical for a second, but hopefully this will stir some creativity in people.
That's a good word of the day, pedantic.
I use it more than once, yes, because I was making myself fun of myself from being pedantic before. But anyway, technical ideas for how to achieve depth. For me, I think it's a few things. One, obviously, there's the length of things like reverbs and delays, right? That is the most obvious thing that we think about. Longer reverbs will sound more like they're far away, and drier sounds will sound more up front. That's obvious. But the lesser known ones, I think, are one, EQ. Brighter sounds tend to be closer. Darker sounds tend to be further away. That is number two. Number three is, I think there's also this aspect of width, where if you take the same sound of the same brightness, same dryness or wetness, and you pan it hard to one side, it will sound closer than if it's pan center. Like, if you've ever noticed, like, you have like super dry, bright electric guitars that are panned hard left and right, like they sound like they're leaping out of the speakers at you. But if you take a guitar and you darken the top of it, you pan it center and maybe make it wet, all of a sudden it's way further back in the soundstage. So that difference of hardness of panning versus centering, further out comes closer to you, and centered goes further away. And then the last one that's, I think, super important to recognize is transients. In real life, transients get swallowed up the further away we are from them. So the more air they have to pass through, the more the transients are softened. So when I hear a lot of really fast attack compression, that brings things further back. And when I hear transients that like pop out, where the snare and the kick are like jumping out at you, those, again, are brought further forward to me. So I think those are the three major things. There's wetness, or I guess four major things. There's wetness, there's brightness, there's left to right versus centered, and then there is transient softness versus transient exaggeration. And I think those are the main things that play the front to back in my ear, in my mind. I don't know if you have any that resonates with you, Mark.
One thing to add to that is there is a very big difference between phantom center on speakers versus headphones. So a lot of people are now mixing in headphones more than ever. Like when COVID kicked in really hard, I was in Washington and I needed to mix this Netflix movie, music for the Netflix movie called Moxie. And I didn't know how I was going to do it. Like, I had my analog chain with me in Washington, but I really didn't have speakers. So I ended up getting headphones, that I'm like, okay, here we go. It wasn't really a thing that a lot of people were doing before. Now it's very normal. But the difference between phantom center on speakers versus headphones are so different. So when you're dealing with like depth, you have to learn both ways, because as you say, like kick drum transient. And here's a little trick I always did, which is when I'm doing like an ambience of a kick drum off of a trigger, let's say, you get your normal kick drum, and then I would put like a stereo sounding room sample underneath it. They both have pretty sharp transients. What I do is I end up putting like a Trans X or some sort of design transient designer and whack the crap off that kick drum first transient, because then it sounds like it just got pushed back into the room. So all you're getting is the ambience of that. That's what I mean. When you're listening in headphones, that changes differently than your phantom center on speakers.
Yeah.
So just be aware of that.
Brilliant.
Out there, all you jokers.
All right. Couple more quick ones here. Let's see what I've got is William Roberts. Actually, it looks like this one is directed at me, but I've got to answer because no one has ever asked it on a live stream before. Does Justin play any instruments? Do you have a background in music theory? I never thought to ask that before, but for some reason I suspect you play piano or drums. Thank you. Yes, I do play piano and drums and guitar and bass and harmonica and mandolin, and you give me an instrument and I will play it mediocrely. I'm like Beck or Prince if they were just okay instead of amazing. So that's my line.
So just okay.
Yes.
Same as me. Just okay.
Yes, I'm like just okay at any instrument that you give me, but I think in my 20s, I stopped playing in bands, stopped writing music, stopped, because for me, I felt like I was too competitive with the artists I was producing and engineering when I was the audio engineer guy as well as a musician. I just felt sometimes like, oh, I should go in and play that, or I could fix that, or I could help them write this part. And I felt like I had too much of an urge to micromanage the artists. And when I kind of like let that fall by the wayside and put all of my skill points into engineering and producer psychology, it just helped me get more and better out of my artists, because the focus was about them. And I was able to take the focus off of me, and it became about facilitating bringing out the best in them rather than feeling like I should be doing that. And for me, I needed to kind of put it aside. I was the same way.
Yeah. And I can also tell you that at one time, 20 years ago, I was like the world's best rhythm guitar player. I was so good at interesting chords and creative chords and finger picking really good, and now I'm so rusty and I don't even know 80% of the chords I used to know. And yeah, it's just such a competitive thing to keep going at it, and I just don't have any interest in doing it as much as I used to. I can tell you that.
Yep.
Let's do one more question.
All right, this is the last one that's super on topic. We've been talking about modulation, and for those of you who joined this live stream late, or just a reminder to those of you who somehow haven't gone to soundtoys.com yet to get the Microshift, go over to soundtoys.com. Not the Microshift, I'm sorry, the Phase Mistress. It is totally free right now, so go get that. I'm not talking about free for 30 days. I'm talking about free forever if you just go and claim it now through November 15th. So check that out. So since our original conversation topic was things like phase and modulation effects, the question here was, do you ever think about using phasers or modulation effects on reverb? So is this something, and maybe you can apply this not just to phase modulation effects, but what kinds of effects might you use on reverb returns in general? And then are these kinds of effects ever part of that mix?
Absolutely. I've done it many times, if not 80% of the time. I mean, I have presets in my template where I have specific, usually either delays or some sort of modulating aspect changing going into that before it hits the reverb. I've done videos on it showing just some avenues about it, but that also creates, you know, a very different approach. You can hear stuff in, you know, in the 80s when reverb was kind of king. There was all sorts of modulation stuff happening in reverbs, and you could just barely hear it in the wet signal. And you would always go, well, that sounds like a music hall on a Lexicon 224, but then it has like either a delay or some sort of chorus or flanging thing that's going inside of it. And I think that's another one of those elements where you can just stand on your own. In fact, now I'm thinking about it, this song would have been neat to have something like that on the reverb center of the vocal. Maybe next time.
Yeah. Beautiful. All right. Well, Marc, if people wanted to keep up with what you're doing, what are some of the best places to check you out and follow what you're doing?
You know, I don't have social media.
I noticed that.
I
like
avoided it for so long, and I never got on Facebook. And I would say, you know, keep poking on Produce Like a Pro. I'll show up there every once in a while still. And just, you know, I'm around. You can go to my website and find me. I'm an old school guy where I have a website still, and I try to answer every email that I get thrown through that.
Well, if there's enough popular demand, maybe we'll have you back on this channel. So people, if you have liked having Marc Daniel Nelson here on this channel, let not only me and Marc, but also the powers that be know that you like content with Marc Daniel Nelson on the SonicScoop channel. You type those comments in, you type in the live chat, you say, give me more Marc. And I bet you there will be ways in which more Marc will be provided. Now,
give
also,
me a hot dog. Give me a corn dog. Corn dog with mustard.
What are the places to check out both your plugins and your courses? Because I know you have some of both.
The courses, which I think that's on the...
are you on Pro Mix Academy? Is that where you are?
Pro Mix Academy, I believe that's what that is underneath, which I haven't done one of those in a long time, and I know Warren wants to do another one of those. My plugin is the Pulsar Modular 455, so you can go on their channel and find that.
Sweet.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. I hate self-promoting. It's awful, which is why the whole, it's just really tough doing that.
I'll do it for you.
How people do it. Yeah.
Check out Marc Daniel Nelson's plugin. It's on the Pulsar website. You got to check it out. It's great. And also check out his courses. If you like learning from Marc this much, I mean, you've just spent an hour and 15 minutes of your life with Marc, and clearly you're enjoying it because you're here at the end of this video. Go to Pro Mix Academy and type in Marc, and I'm sure you can get courses, and go check it out. Big shout out and thanks again to Soundtoys. I'm going to recommend you go ahead and get the Phase Mistress completely for free for the rest of your life if you claim it now. If you are checking this out after it's no longer free anymore, then I'll tell you what, go to soundtoys.com anyway, download the whole bundle, try out the whole bundle for free for 30 days. And I'm sure that once you've given them your email, they will let you know the next time they're giving away a free plugin, which might happen around this time again next year. So you definitely want to be getting messages from them. If you prefer the messages from us, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell so you know when new videos are coming out, and go to SonicScoop.com where you can sign up for the newsletter, and we will let you know whenever there is free stuff or great deals on some of the brands we work with, like Soundtoys. They are one of my favorites. And another one of my favorites is Marc Daniel Nelson, who just joined me today. Marc, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me and watching.
All right. Thank you guys for hanging out with us. See you next time.
See ya.